Okay, so I'm gonna hit record. All right, so welcome everybody to this week's Growing Together from a Distance topic. So we're talking about the fact that palms aren't trees and why this is actually important in their maintenance, their care, and some things that you may look at and think that doesn't look right. I think something's wrong when it actually is fine. It's just a characteristics of palm. So this can be a little bit, hard because people say, well, palms are called palm trees. Well, we just stick the tree at the end. They're actually just called palms. And I know it's completely ironic that the Florida state tree is a palm. I have a lot of botanist friends that we all kind of get together and giggle about that. But it is, palms are vital to society. They've been used for many things. They're just not a tree. So today, what we're going to talk about is first I'm going to define a tree, because if I'm telling you palms aren't trees, we need to set the definition of what a tree actually is. I'll go over the differences between trees and palms, followed by some specific palm characteristics. We'll look into some common nutrient deficiencies and how to tell if your palm has it. And then I have a couple of the common or really major diseases that you might have in a palm that, needs taken care of right away. So first off, let's define a tree. Short definition is they are single-stemmed, tall, woody plants that also have branching happen. So if you're a smaller multi-stem woody plant, you would be considered a shrub. But a tree, two of the main features are they do have branching, and the big thing is they produce true wood. So certain plants, like palms, have wood-like tissue, but it's not true wood. And the difference between true wood and this alternative form has to do with really cellular level growth. We'll talk about it a tiny bit, but not a lot, so don't worry. So as opposed comparing to palms, palms don't have branching. It's really rare for a palm to ever have branching. You can have single or multi-stem palms, but the big thing here as well is they produce no true wood. Another thing to talk about is they actually only have one main growth point for above ground growth, whereas trees have multiple different growth areas referred to as meristems. So let's start with looking at that cellular wood production. So on your left is the type of cellular growth that leads to true wood, and on your right is what it looks like in palm stems. Now, even without necessarily knowing exactly what you're looking at, you should be able to see that one of them is nice, neatly organized with the vascular elements in a ring. So each one of those little circles you see on both sides are where all of the vascular tissue is. So it's the xylem and the phloem, and everything in between is referred to as ground tissue. So it's just kind of like filler cells to hold everything together. They're important, but not for this talk. So in wood producing plants, they grow in this ring, and they have what's referred to as a vascular cambium that grows to produce xylem and phloem tissue on either side. And this is produced through secondary growth, whereas in the palm stem, it's all primary growth. So they get a little bit of extra growth around the cells to strengthen them, and they have lots of fibers in them, but they don't get growth rings, and they don't get that really organized woody structure. If you've ever tried to cut down a palm tree with a chainsaw, or know somebody that has, they can tell you right away that cutting through a palm tree is a whole lot harder than trying to cut through most of the trees that produce wood. And it's because it's really fibrous and you can't get the chainsaw to really cut straight. It kind of goes a bit all over the place. So as the wood production grows, you get those tree rings over time. And most places, especially temperate locations, you can actually tell how old a plant is based on the rings. It's a little harder in Florida because we don't have true ends to growing seasons for most plants, so it's a little harder to differentiate the rings. But with the rings, you can also tell based on how thick or thin they are, you can see kind of what the growing conditions were. At least were they good, were they bad? You can see signs of fire. And you can get information from growth rings that you don't get the same way or at all really when you cut into palms. So if you were to cut into a palm and look at it, all of those little black dots are that vascular tissue. So it's really scattered throughout. And you do have a little bit higher concentration on the outside for that stability, but it's not there in the same manner. So palms don't have that secondary growth, and that's really that big thing. So palms don't grow in girth, they grow upright. So when they're seedlings, they spend a lot of time forming the root structure, and then the root structures form all of the different vessel elements, really. They're forming all of the different vascular tubes, basically, or vascular straws that are going to go through, and then those go up into the plant. So the plant's not going to produce more vascular tissue as it grows. It's just going to make it longer as it grows up. So one of the things you can do looking at palms to figure out kind of if there's been changes as far as nutrients or growing conditions is palms will grow where their trunks maybe will indent in or kind of bulge out. And if they indent in, it indicates that there was something going on that limited growth. So they didn't have as much extra nutrition to form kind of the bulk of that ground tissue I mentioned earlier. And then if you plant them in a new place where they have lots of wonderful nutrients, it can bulk out a little bit because, again, it's filling in the space in between. The actual elements that are moving, the xylem and the phloem, again, you're not getting more, they're just kind of changing their location. And it's not uncommon that when you transplant something from a nursery to a landscape yard that's getting a lot of fertilizer and water that you see that, and you can tell that when the tree was a certain height, that's when it got some extra nutrients. Okay, so again, with that scattered vascular tissue. So I mentioned earlier that palms grow from what's referred to as a primary meristem. So the meristem tissue in a palm is protected by all of the leaves at the top or the crown. And this is actually a cross section looking into that. So what you can see is precursors to flower development and also precursors to leaf development. And underneath that is that meristem tissue. And that's where all the cell divisions happening and differentiation goes on, where everything is turned into either a flower or inflorescent, or it's getting turned into leaves. And woody plants, again, have more growth points, which is one of the major differences between what we have going on. So if palms aren't trees, what exactly are they? They're referred to as arborescent plants. So they're tree-like without having all of the characteristics to be a true tree. Some other plants that fall into this category are bananas, and even tree ferns. So the top left picture is actually a cross section of what the trunk inside of a tree fern looks like. So all of these are plants that can get tall, but again, they're not producing that true wood. Now, with palms not being trees, this actually makes them able to handle certain things that woody specimens absolutely cannot handle. And we're going to be talking about those moving forward. So characteristics. One of the first characteristics that I often get questions about has to do with roots. So palms have what are called as advantageous roots, or some people say adventitious roots, which means that they can grow roots from any part of the stem if it has the right conditions. So the picture on your top left could indicate that there's excess water being exposed to that trunk, or that they've maybe lowered the soil since it was planted. Now, being able to grow roots really, really easily makes palms a lot more simple to transplant when you're comparing to woody plants. Woody plants, there's a lot more involved. You have to have a certain root ball size, and then it takes a very long time for those roots to establish. It takes time for a palm to establish as well, but it doesn't take nearly as long. And again, they can grow the roots anywhere. So if you plant them a little too deep, it's not going to hurt them the same way that it's going to hurt a typical woody specimen. Now, the plant on your right is actually showing how roots can grow from anywhere. This is probably 3-4 feet up the trunk where it's actually producing roots. Now, this is something that can happen, and it's not uncommon if your sprinklers are not adjusted right and the trunk is getting sprayed. Because one of the things that stops the cells from producing roots above ground is the fact that it's dry, there's no water. So if there's a large amount of water, the palms are more likely to actually produce roots in places that you wouldn't normally want them. Neither of these are any harm to the plant. It's completely healthy. It just tends to be unsightly, and people that have them don't like it. So another thing that can happen with those root problems, and it depends on what palm you have, because the palm on the top left here, you see that the bark hasn't split. But in this one, you can see that the base or that bark has split. And that's, again, the roots are developing and just kind of pushing that out of the way so they can get to water and nutrients. So if you make sure that you're watering at the base of your palms, this is less likely to happen. But palms are a little bit strange, and sometimes they do odd things. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. It just, you know, they're special. So shedding leaves is up next. So palms shed leaves at different times. And it's really common to see this, what's referred to as a skirt, around certain species of palms. There's no health concern here. It's perfectly natural. Some people don't like it, so they will trim them, and that's fine if that's your aesthetic. I definitely would recommend waiting until the leaves actually turn brown, because palms and also sagos and other cycads have this great ability that they can pull the nutrients out of the green leaves and then use that towards new growth. So if you're cutting off green leaves, you're cutting off nutrients and increasing your need to fertilize, which, you know, if you can get the nutrients back into the plant, wait till it turns brown, cut them off then. Now, a safety issue, if you say, let's say you buy a property and this is the state of the palms on the property you buy. First off, I definitely advise you to hire a professional. And second off, you don't want to stand under it, because if while you're trimming, those leaves come loose and start to fall down, it will be enough weight to kill somebody standing under it just from those leaves falling. So always hire a professional. And if you're doing it yourself, you know, you have to make sure your pole saw is long enough that you're not standing right under it. Because as you're pruning, the connective tissue, referred to as the boots, which we'll get to in a few slides, if it comes loose, again, it just comes sliding down. And I've been in arborist training where they've told us horror stories about people dying, and I don't want that to be you. So hiring a professional, I advise that. There's certain things it's worth spending your money on. But again, no health concern. And if you're in an area where you do want to keep this and it is allowed, this is a great habitat for different animals. Some of them are desired, some not so much. So it's a great place for bats to roost, but it's also a place that rats like to live as well. So that's just something to consider when you're thinking about how you want to manage everything. Now, speaking of leaves, palms have several different kind of leaves. And this is just 3 generic leaves. So you can have a pinnate leaf where you have that rachis. So you're going to have the point where the leaf is attached to the trunk. And then you have what's referred to as a petiole. And then basically once the petiole starts having the green leaflets coming off of it, that's referred to as a rachis. And you have individual leaflets. You can also have something called bipinnate leaves, which basically has the rachis and then 2 more that come off of it. Something like a fishtail palm is an example of that. Then you have palmate leaf, and anytime you have a palmate leaf in any kind of vegetation, just think your palm, right? And where your palm attaches to your wrist and then your fingers come out, that's the look that you get with palmate leaves. That means they're all attached at one location and spreading out sort of like fingers. Now, palms also have something called a costopalmate leaf, which is kind of like a cross between the two, where you have that sort of palmate structure, but you get more separation between the individual little leaflets. All right, so I promised to talk about boots, and I don't mean shoes. So the boots are that area where the leaves are actually attached to the trunk. Now, some palms retain the boots, some palms don't. Other palms drop them at different times. So palms that do retain boots for a length of time can retain them anywhere between 5 and 50 years, depending on the species. You can clean them off if you prefer that look, but it's not necessary. So exactly why palm boots are retained in a plant isn't exactly known. There's thoughts that maybe it's just genetic, that they drop them at different times. There's other thought that maybe it has to do with fruiting and flowering, and they hold the boots on until they're ready to flower, and then maybe they drop them. My favorite there's no way for us to know it's true, but it's a fun story to tell your kids. So that story has to do with holding on to boots or holding on to those leaves longer, basically to protect that apical meristem from herbivores back in the time of the dinosaurs. So there's no way for us to go back in time and know that's for sure, but it's, you know, always fun to, you know, tell your kids, oh, look, that palm's trying to avoid dinosaurs. So another thing that can happen with palms is something called scruff. And this isn't uncommon on young palm leaves, and it sort of looks like a scale, but it's actually perfectly natural and will come off over time. So you can always try to scrape it off, and if you're really not sure if it's a problem, you can bring in one of the leaves into this office or send us an email, and we're happy to help you figure out what's going on and determine, is it just scruff or do you have an insect issue? Certain scales can be a problem on some palms. Generally, the taller a palm is, the less likely you are to see an insect problem because it is so high, but also the higher it gets, the less likely it is to get a large variety of insects like scales and aphids because they tend to like lower, lower vegetation. Okay, so next we're going to talk about erosion from the stem. This isn't uncommon to see as palms get older, and it actually isn't a health concern. It's just that over time, sometimes that bark erodes, you can have woodpeckers coming up. But remember, because that plant isn't growing out, losing the bark isn't as much of a problem. Because again, it grows up. Whereas if you were to do something like this to a woody tree, that's actually going to kill it. So this is another one of those examples where the palm actually has some adaptations that make it better to handle certain situations than woody trees can. Okay, so next is, we're going to talk a little bit about flowers and fruits. So flowers occur in these things called inflorescence, and inflorescence are basically where you have these stalks with large amounts of flowers on them. And this is something to consider when you're selecting where to plant trees in your yard, is that one, palms drop leaves, and two, you can get these large inflorescence of flowers and fruit that can be very heavy and can be very damaging if they're right up against your house or your pool screen. And you want to make sure that you're kind of planting them far enough away so the plant has room to grow. Or if you aren't wanting the plant to fruit, make sure you're out there early on to trim off those inflorescence so you don't have any of those issues. So I'm going to ask a question, and you can either write it in the Q&A. I think you have to write it in the Q&A. We don't have a chat. So I wondered if anybody knew what the fruit classification in all palms are. And I'll pull up the Q&A real quick so I can see if anybody answers. All right, we've got one for droop. Oh, we have a chat too. I found the chat. We've got not a clue. Hi, Yolanda from Osceola. Got another one for droop, two more for droop. And wait for one more person to answer, and then I'll tell you the answer. Come on, one more person, give a guess. A nut. Okay, so those are good guesses, and in fact, 3 of you are right. It is a droop. So a nut's a little bit different, but a droop, let me get down to my definition so I say it right. So basically a droop is when you have one or more stony seeds covered by a fleshy, mealy, or fibrous mesocarp. And the mesocarp is that middle section between the outside of the fruit and the inside seed. So a coconut is a drupe. So that seed inside, that actual coconut where the milk is, that's the actual seed, and the husk around it is what makes that a drupe. So yes, you got, if you answered drupe, you did get that correct. So congratulations. Now, something else to mention, because I did mention that these flowers occur in inflorescence, depending on where those flowers come out in relation to the leaves in the crown, you can actually have a problem called crown split. And I apologize, the picture's not that great of a quality, but you kind of get the idea that the inflorescence have come out and they've pushed all those leaves down. Now those leaves, depending on if the connection with the tree broke, they may die, maybe they'll come back. But if you notice that you're starting to get a lot of fruit and it's pushing down on your leaves, you likely want to get someone out there to help you trim back and just reduce the weight with from that fruit. Not necessarily taking all of it. It is great. They're great food sources for our native birds. And some of the fruit you can even eat yourself. But this is something that you might contact us and say, what's wrong? What disease do I have? You actually don't have a disease in this case. It's just that the fruit was weighing down all of those leaves. So moving on, we're going to go on to nutrient issues. And I thought I'd just take a second and see if anybody had questions about anything before I move on to nutrients. So anything I've talked about so far that we have questions about?
Nope, nobody has any questions. Nothing's in the
All right.
chat.
Cool. So we're going to move on to nutrient issues. Now, I'm not going over every possible nutrient issue, and nutrient issues can show up slightly differently in different plants. So I'm going to show you just some general things to look at when thinking about nutrients. So first up, we have an example of a potassium deficiency in what's in a princess palm. And what you can see here is you can see those yellow little dots happening all over the leaves. That's one of those signs that in general, if you have yellow dots on your leaf, it's likely a potassium deficiency. So you're pretty safe getting some palm fertilizer and adding it to help bring this back. Once the palms get fertilizer, they have nutrients, they're able to correct this issue. Some of the other ones we're going to talk about, they won't correct just because the tissue's actually degraded too far for that. So an example here is this example that also indicates potassium deficiency. So one thing to note here is that the browning is occurring from the tips in because there's different things that can occur from that rachis out that can be more disease related. So next up is a manganese deficiency. This is shown in a queen palm, and I'm going to show it in a royal palm with a slightly more close-up image next. You can see again that browning and that kind of ribboning effect that's happening to those leaflets. So that's another one of those signs. So one thing to consider here as well is that you're not seeing this in the brand new growth or those spikes that are coming up. You're seeing it in growth that's come out a little bit, that's already come out a little bit because there are specific diseases that are associated with having the new growth spikes actually being brown. So manganese is fun, and then we also have magnesium. So magnesium deficiency, you're going to get a little bit of that yellowing and a little bit of that browning, but you don't have as much of the ribboning effect. Now, potassium, magnesium, and manganese are probably the three largest issues that are generally seen in Florida as far as nutrient deficiencies in palms, but nitrogen can also be an issue. So this is a nitrogen deficiency. You can see it at the base of this Canary Island date palm. And usually yellowing has to do with nitrogen deficiency, but yellowing is not always bad. You really need to know your plant because there are certain varieties of palm that have yellow petioles and yellow, a yellow rachis. Certain things like, let's see, areca palms are one of them. Let's see, some cultivars of coconut palm. So there's quite a few palms that can actually have this. So if you're selecting a palm in the nursery and it already has yellow on it and it's actually healthy, you know, make a note of that so that you're not too worried about yellowing on your particular plant in that location. If the leaflets are turning yellow, that is still something to be concerned about. All right, any specific questions about nutrient deficiencies before we move on to diseases? We might be a little bit short today in time, but you know, it's Friday.
Ron wants to know how often do they fruit?
It depends on the palm species specifically. There's really a range, and it can take several years before palm will even fruit for the very first time. So if you have a specific palm in mind, you can email me and I'll get you back that specific information. All right. Any other questions? And one thing, So Florida's great because we are a location that we can do grow a lot of different palms, but in our location, we actually can't grow coconut palms because they do have specific adaptations that leads them to, one, need to be closer to the beach, and two, a little bit farther south than where we are. My mom keeps begging for me to figure out how she can grow coconut palm here, and I keep telling her that we really can't, and I was sorry. All right, so we're going to move on to diseases, and I'm only talking about a few of them. And again, that's because these are the big ones that you need to do something about right away. And one of them you actually need to pre-treat to prevent it. So first off, we're going to talk about just a little bit about Phytophthora bud rot. So the first sign you're going to see here is discoloration or wilting in the new growth, and I have some of those images there for you. So with Phytophthora, you're going to need a fungicide to be able to actually take care of it. Now, a lot of times with the different diseases I'm about to show you, you might need to get testing to find out exactly what fungus you have, so you know exactly what fungicide you need to use, because the fungicides can be a little bit different depending on which disease you actually have. But Phytophthora, if you don't have excessively wet soils, you shouldn't really have that. Phytophthora is actually a water mold that's readily found in soil anyway, so you don't really get spikes unless you have too much water going on. There are things that you can put in the soil to kill it. One thing to note as you do that is it is likely killing any beneficial fungus in the area as well. So next up, Fusarium wilt. Now, Fusarium wilt's an interesting one because you have the wilting that's focused kind of on one side of the frond, so it's a little bit easier to identify. And if you cut off the frond and look in the stem and you see kind of that one side location where it's rotting out, that's how you know that you're going to have Fusarium. And there are fungicide treatments for that you can get to actually treat this and save your tree, as long as you catch it early enough. If it's too far gone, you know, if you went on vacation and you came back and your whole tree's brown, there's not much we can do. But this it's not super fast, so you should be able to kind of notice it and get this treated. All right, so next up is Ganoderma butt rot. So Ganoderma is what's referred to as a white rot fungus because it actually attacks the lignin and cellulose in the plant. So if your plant gets this, it's going to die. It needs removed right away, and you really should not plant another palm in the location for several years at best. So I want to show you what the fruiting bodies look like of this. So with Ganoderma rot, you get the browning of the leaves, but usually people don't really notice it until they actually do have the conchs as well. So you see here a beginning, mature, and old version of this Ganoderma, and I actually have an example here. If you can see me at all, I'm currently holding up an example of one of these small Ganoderma conchs. This particular variety wasn't found on a palm. I wouldn't save that one just because I wouldn't want a chance spreading it. This particular Ganoderma is one that would grow on woody trees when they were dead and rotting. But you can kind of see here the similar pattern that you would want to look for. Basically, if you have anything growing off the side of your palm, it's not a good thing. So I did say we were going to be short today. Our final disease that we're going to talk about is lethal bronzing, because this one keeps popping up a lot in our plant clinic for questions as well. This is one that also has no treatment, but there is an antibiotic that you can get injected in your trees in advance if you're really worried that this is going to come and attack your palms. So maybe if you have a landscape where you have a lot of palms, they're larger, well, even small palms, you can actually have get an arborist to come out, talk to them about it beforehand to make sure you have an arborist that has the antibiotic to treat it, because lethal bronzing is actually a bacterial disease. So fungicides aren't going to work. You're going to need that pre-antibiotic treatment. And I do think you need to treat it on a relatively regular basis to make sure it's inoculated from any issues with that. So I wanted to keep this short and sweet to not get into too much of the botany behind the differences. So this is actually the end of our presentation. I have some additional resources and we can get those out to you guys in an email. So at this point, I'm open to more questions. Let's see, Paul had a question about, is the chemical applied to roots or foliage? What was that in reference to? Most of the diseases that I was just talking about, they would be root applications. Let's get the chat open. Thank you. I like to keep it short and sweet. I don't want to talk more than I have to, at least at times. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, nor, I think it's pronounced, we're going to go with participant Klein. I don't know what you mean by you don't fertilize them ever. I'm not sure what you mean there. Okay, so Pat, the good time to cut the berry stems off, it depends on your goal. If you don't want the berries falling, the earlier the better. If you want to let them go to fruit, you can just wait until the fruit drops and then cut them. So it's really kind of up to what your aesthetic is for them. The palm, you can cut them off really whenever you want, and the palm's going to be able to handle it. Okay, so it looks like you don't fertilize them ever was the question. You should fertilize your palms, and you should fertilize them relatively regularly because potassium, magnesium, and manganese are really common to be deficient in our soils. So we want to add those in to make sure we have nice, healthy palms. Yes, companies that work on your lawn can fertilize for palms as well. Just make sure they're using a palm fertilizer because it tends to have a little bit more of those micronutrients in it. So the micronutrients are the ones like manganese, where they don't need a lot of it, but if they don't have it, it's really bad. Bees do really enjoy the flowers, so if you'd like to keep them available for the bees, you can keep them up until at least the inflorescent flowers do stop. And let's see. Talk palm propagation. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of experience directly with palm propagation. But if you'd like to shoot me an email, I can get you in contact with an expert that can help you with that. Best time to fertilize palms, we never stop growing in Florida, so you can really fertilize them. You can fertilize them in the spring, you can fertilize them in the fall, but also if you notice that they need fertilizer, you can go ahead and fertilize them because they are not going to be able to wait if they start to be low. And I was talking with somebody yesterday that was having an issue, and they had waited 2 years between fertilizing, and it took 2 years before their palm really showed any issues. So it depends on the nutrients currently available in your yard as well.
Jamie, you want to do the poll question, please?
Yeah, go ahead, and I'm going to look at some of these other questions. Wanda's going to go ahead and launch the poll. It's 2 questions. If you could take a second to just answer that, we would really appreciate it. And I've got 2 more questions here while that's going on. I had a disease that spread. Was it Vercillium? It could have been. I would have to look. I would have to see the symptoms to know for sure, because Vercillium wilt looks like several other wilts as well. So if you have images of it, you're welcome to send them to me and I can look at it and let you know if that's what it looks like it was. And if it was a professional that told you that's what it was, it's highly likely they were correct, but I'm happy to give a second opinion. If you cut them off early, again, if you're cutting the inflorescence off early, it depends on the palm, but most palms don't have a whole lot of backup for putting out a bunch more. But you can, you can always wait until the bees get a nice, good snack off of them and then cut them off before the fruit starts to become a problem. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Yolanda. All right. We've got all that. Thank you guys very much. We very much appreciate that. And it looks like, I'm so happy everybody that answered the poll actually learned something today. So that's always exciting. So if nobody has any other questions, we will go ahead and
Ron wants to know if there a PDF of this class.
We don't have a PDF, but we are going to be posting it on YouTube. So I've been recording it. I'm going to, we're going to do some background stuff, and then I will, either myself or Wanda will send out an email with a link and a link to the YouTube and also a link to the resources for the class. You're welcome, Janet. I didn't miss anything else. All right.